A typewriter sitting in Stephen Marfeo's mother's house was matched to a pair of anonymous letters that told police exactly how he committed a horrific crime. These were letters that Stephen himself almost certainly typed, and somehow, even after all of that, nobody was ever charged. No body was ever found. The disappearance of Doreen Marfeo is one of the most disturbing cold cases I've ever covered, and perhaps the real mystery is how this case was never solved. Doreen Dobson met Stephen Marfeo in Rhode Island in 1976, when she was 21, and they married 2 years later on July 7th, 1978. They settled on Hartford Avenue in Johnston, Rhode Island, a working-class suburb just west of Providence. Doreen was a purchasing director at the Rhode Island School of Design, and from what anyone could tell, she was good at it. She was a normal person living a normal life until the marriage had started to fracture. By the late 1980s, things between Doreen and Stephen were deteriorating badly enough that Doreen sought counseling. She eventually made a decision that, in hindsight, feels devastating. She quit her job to focus on saving the relationship. She walked away from a stable career with benefits and a professional reputation because she believed the marriage was worth fighting for. Whether Stephen felt the same way is a different question, because while Doreen was trying to fix things, Stephen had hired private investigators to follow her. He suspected she was having an affair, but the investigators tailed her and found no evidence of one. Despite this, his paranoia continued to grow, and he appears to have become increasingly obsessed by the unverified belief that his wife was cheating. On the morning of March 29, 1990, Stephen Marfeo went to work like any other day, but his lunch break that afternoon was fairly odd. Stephen typically took 20 to 30 minutes for lunch. That day, he took 70. He later told investigators that he'd gone home and eaten lunch with Doreen, then returned to work. When he got home around 4 in the afternoon, she was gone, at least. That's what he would claim. He said that a suitcase packed with about a week's worth of clothing had been taken, along with $600 from a small safe. But here's the thing. Doreen's 1984 Ford Tempo was still sitting in the driveway, and her 2 beloved cats were still in the house. Roughly $50,000 sat untouched in joint bank accounts which she could have accessed at any time. The story Stephen was selling was fairly implausible right from the start. His wife had spontaneously decided to leave him, packed a bag, grabbed $600 in cash, and then walked away from her car, her cats, and 50 grand in the bank. To make matters even more suspicious, she allegedly did so without telling her mother, to whom she spoke almost daily. To make matters more bizarre, Stephen waited 2.5 days to report her missing, despite freely admitting he knew she was gone immediately. For about 2.5 months, the case went essentially nowhere. Johnston police had a missing woman, a husband whose story didn't quite add up, and not much else. Then, on June 13, 1990, an anonymous typed letter arrived at the Johnston Police Department, and a week later, a second one followed. The second letter laid out what allegedly happened. It described Stephen losing his temper after finding Doreen sleeping on the couch. According to the letter, he strangled her, stuffed her shoes and handbag into a shopping bag, and dumped her body in a pond somewhere in Providence. This letter described him as being highly skilled in deception, implying that the police shouldn't take his word at face value. The first letter took a different angle entirely, and it accused Doreen of carrying on affairs with multiple former co-workers. Police sent the letters to a psycholinguistics expert at Syracuse University for analysis, and his conclusion was blunt. Based on the language patterns, phrasing, and psychological profile embedded in the text, he determined that Stephen had very likely written both letters. He went further, stating that Stephen was a logical suspect in his wife's slaying, which personally to me seems fairly obvious. Despite this opinion of a forensic expert, no further evidence was recovered and no charges were laid at that time. In July of 1991, more than a year after the letters arrived, police seized several typewriters that Stephen had access to, and they got a match. The first letter had been produced on a typewriter found in Stephen's mother's house. Stephen denied writing the letters, and he insisted the police were fabricating evidence. He lawyered up and stopped cooperating with the investigation, though the extent that he was truly cooperating to begin with is an open question. Despite this additional link to the crime, the police claimed they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, and for nearly a decade that's where things stood. But before I get into that, I want to take a bit of time to describe the somewhat unusual family dynamic, as well as a famous appearance by Stephen on national television. Doreen's mother, Laura Dobson, never stopped waiting for her daughter to walk through the door. What makes Laura's situation worse is that she apparently believed in Stephen's innocence. Even as investigators were pointing fingers squarely at her son-in-law, Laura reportedly described him as kind and supportive. Meanwhile, the case got a burst of national exposure in November 1993 when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. In a somewhat shocking twist, given who the prime suspect was, Stephen participated in the segment. He portrayed himself as a grieving husband who had been unfairly targeted by the police simply because he was the spouse. More insidiously, he also portrayed Doreen as someone who had started behaving erratically in the year before her disappearance. In retrospect, it appears that he had used the segment to build public credibility for his version of events, rather than any serious attempt to find his missing wife. The segment brought the story to tens of millions of living rooms across the country and generated a number of tips, none of which went anywhere. 9 years after Doreen disappeared, Stephen Marfeo told his family he was going on vacation to get his head straight. What happened next makes it very difficult to maintain any theory of Stephen's innocence. On July 30th, 1999, Stephen tracked down his estranged girlfriend, a 38-year-old woman named Laura Vincent. He fatally shot her and attempted to do the same to her boyfriend, but he survived despite sustaining severe injuries. After the shootings, Stephen got in his car and drove north to the Barkhamstead Reservoir, a remote, heavily wooded area in northwestern Connecticut. A state trooper spotted his vehicle and approached, but before the cop could reach him, Stephen pulled the curtains on his life. In his car, police found a letter addressed to his mother, where he explained why he committed these crimes. He described it as something he simply had to do, that talking to professionals or friends or family wasn't part of his plan. But the part of the note that investigators zeroed in on was his reference to Doreen. He expressed guilt over her disappearance and wrote that he'd been alive 9 years too long, a time frame that lined up exactly with how long Doreen had been missing. He didn't confess to anything specific, and he didn't say where her body was. He just carried whatever he knew with him to that reservoir in Connecticut, and whatever the truth was about Doreen Marfeo, it went to the grave with him. Personally, I think the picture here is about as clear as a circumstantial case gets. You've got a husband who took a suspiciously long lunch on the day his wife vanished, and a wife who left behind her car, her toothbrush, her cats, and $50,000. There was a 2.5-day gap before Stephen, who was an extremely paranoid person by all accounts, even bothered calling the police. There was also anonymous letters describing the method of her slaying, written on a typewriter from his own family's home, with a psycholinguistic profile pointing directly at him. And then, 9 years later, he produced a final letter referencing a sense of guilt about Doreen's disappearance, and a statement saying that's where his story should have come to an end. The only thing missing is a body, and that's been the case's curse from the beginning. Without physical remains, Without forensic evidence tying Stephen to a specific act of violence, prosecutors never felt they had enough to bring charges. It's also worth noting that Stephen's 1999 rampage followed a pattern of escalating possessiveness and control. He couldn't accept Doreen's perceived independence, that she was getting promoted at work and doing well in life. 9 years later, he couldn't accept that another woman was moving on to another relationship, and if he couldn't have someone, nobody could. There's been some speculation about whether the Barkhamsted Reservoir might have held some significance beyond being a remote location. Some investigators have wondered whether it was chosen because Doreen's remains were somewhere nearby, though no search of the area has ever turned up anything conclusive. That could mean the theory is wrong, but it could also mean they haven't looked in the right spot. Connecticut has a lot of woodland and a lot of ponds and small lakes where a body could be hiding. 2 gas station attendants. That's the last thread connecting Elizabeth Kenyon to the world of the living. On March 5th, 1984, those 2 attendants saw a 23-year-old woman in the company of a man they'd later identify from photographs. After that sighting, Elizabeth Kenyon was never seen again, and the man beside her would go on to cut a path of terror across 8 states before meeting his end 6 weeks later. Elizabeth Kenyon lived in an apartment in Coral Gables, Florida, and she was the kind of person who stayed busy. She taught special education at Coral Gables Senior High School and coached the cheerleading squad. Before that, she'd been a cheerleader herself at the University of Miami, and she'd done some fashion modeling on the side and earned the title of Orange Bowl Princess in 1982. At some point before her disappearance, Elizabeth had dated a man named Christopher Wilder. He was a 38-year-old Australian-born real estate developer living in Boynton Beach, about 25 miles south of Palm Beach. He had money, drove nice cars, traveled frequently to Hawaii and the Bahamas, and had a serious interest in photography. On paper, he looked like a successful middle-aged bachelor working his way through the world, but unfortunately for Elizabeth, none of it was true. His criminal record stretched back to his teenage years in Sydney, where at 17 he'd participated in a disturbing assault on a woman at a quarry. The court gave him 1 year of probation and mandatory counseling that included electroshock therapy. He emigrated to the United States in 1969 and settled in South Florida despite his severe criminal record. By 1983, he'd been identified by 2 girls in Boynton Beach as the man who abducted them and forced them into disturbing acts. Criminal charges were pending at the time, but despite this disturbing turn of events, Wilder decided this was the ideal time to propose marriage to Elizabeth. Elizabeth would ultimately say no, though it appears that she had no idea about his ongoing criminal charges. The evening before she vanished, Elizabeth had driven up to Pompano Beach to visit her parents. She stayed until about 9 o'clock that evening and got home around 10. The next day, March 5th, she went to work at Coral Gables High as usual. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, a school security guard and a police officer stationed on campus saw her in the parking lot. She spoke to them briefly, then got into her Chrysler convertible carrying a duffel bag with workout clothes and a curling iron inside, and she drove away. She never came home that night, and she didn't show up for work on March 6th. Her purse was left behind, which, last I checked, isn't the sort of thing a woman leaves if she's planning a trip. 6 days later, on March 11th, her Chrysler convertible turned up abandoned at Miami International Airport. A review of flight manifests suggested that the car sitting in that airport lot was a prop in someone else's staging, not evidence of a voluntary departure. The investigation centered on Wilder almost immediately, since the boyfriend or the spouse is usually the prime suspect. 2 gas station attendants near Miami identified him from photographs as the man who'd been with Kenyon on the day she disappeared. More damning still, when interviewed by the cops, Wilder somehow knew the location of her car before that information had been released to the press. But Elizabeth Kenyon wasn't the first person who was connected to Wilder to disappear that year. 8 days before her disappearance, on February 26th, a 20-year-old aspiring model named Rosario Gonzalez vanished from the Miami Grand Prix. She'd been working as a temporary spokesmodel handing out samples to guests, and she had previously modeled for Wilder. Wilder was also confirmed to have been in attendance that day, and she was seen in the presence of a white male when she was leaving the event. Christopher Wilder was never firmly linked to her disappearance, but he remains the prime suspect. After Kenyon, Wilder's pace accelerated, and in total, Wilder is confirmed to have slain at least 8 women during his 6-week spree, with additional victims suspected. He earned the nickname the Beauty Queen Killer, a nod to his method of targeting attractive young women through offers of modeling and photography. The end came on April 13, 1984. Wilder pulled into a service station in Colebrook, New Hampshire, a small town just south of the Canadian border. He asked for directions to Canada, apparently hoping to flee the country. 2 New Hampshire State Police troopers approached him, and rather than cooperating, Wilder went back to his car and reached for a pistol. One trooper grabbed Wilder from behind in an attempt to restrain him, and in the violent struggle that followed, 2 shots went off, with one hitting Wilder square in the chest. Wilder didn't make it, and with his passing, the whereabouts of numerous young women would be forever sealed. More than 4 decades have passed, and Elizabeth Kenyon's remains have never been found. No crime scene has ever been identified, and no witnesses have come forward with new information. The physical evidence amounts to an abandoned car in an airport parking lot and 2 eyewitness identifications at a gas station. Everything else is built on the overwhelming circumstantial case against a man who can't be questioned and whose full crimes will likely never be known. What's up, everyone? It's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to consider checking out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support to the next level. A farmer outside Cleburne, Texas, noticed the birds first, vultures circling low over the wooded edge of his property. On December 11th, 1972, after a few days of noticing these birds, he went to check. What he found among the trees wasn't a coyote or a deer carcass. It was a human body. A police investigation would reveal that despite the body being badly scavenged by animals, there was still 2 visible wounds to the chest. Aside from that, there was absolutely nothing to identify who this man was, and more than 50 years later, this is where the case would remain. The case would come to be known as Mr. X, and it's one of Johnson County's longest-running unsolved slayings. During a forensic examination, 2 wounds were determined to have been inflicted by a .25 caliber weapon. Notably, no spent shell casings were found at the scene, which told investigators that the victim almost certainly hadn't been shot where he was found. Someone had eliminated this man somewhere else, transported his body to this remote stretch of farmland northwest of Cleburne, and left him in the trees. The location was roughly 14 miles outside of town, far enough from any main road to avoid notice. Investigators at the time estimated the victim was a white male, or possibly Hispanic, and somewhere between 30 and 50 years old. His physical profile was the only thing they had to work with, and it wasn't much. No fingerprint match came back, and no dental records matched any missing person in the system. Local and regional news covered the discovery, but nobody came forward, and for reasons that will become obvious shortly, there may have been a reason no one recognized the man. After exhausting the identification methods available to them in 1972, Authorities buried the man in a pauper's grave at Rose Hill Cemetery in Cleburne. He was given the name Mr. X on his burial record, a placeholder that was never meant to last this long, but the case went cold. During the next 40 years, forensic science changed completely. Johnson County formed its own cold case squad, and in 2012, someone pulled the Mr. X file. For the first time in decades, investigators took a fresh look at the evidence, and it didn't take long for them to decide the remains needed to come out of the ground. In August 2013, Mr. X was exhumed from Rose Hill Cemetery. The remains were sent for modern forensic analysis, including genetic testing. The results changed the profile of the victim substantially and indicated that the original investigators were on the wrong trail. As I had mentioned, the original 1972 estimate had placed the man's age between 30 and 50. New analysis revised that range dramatically downward, likely placing him in his very late teens or early 20s. That age revision reframed the entire case, and the fact that no one reported him took on a different weight. Teenagers and young adults don't generally just vanish without someone noticing, unless they were already disconnected from whatever support system they'd once had. Runaways, drifters, and people who'd aged out of the foster system or left home under bad circumstances. These are the people who vanish without anyone filing a report. As of the most recent updates, Mr. X remains unidentified, but there's good news on the horizon. The DNA Doe Project has taken up work on the case and are applying modern genetic genealogy techniques to the investigations. If Mr. X had any connection to his biological family, this will almost certainly yield his name and identity, which would allow the authorities to begin the next stage of the investigation. Ultimately, though, one of the potential problems with a case like this is that our John Doe could have been adopted or could have spent his life in the foster system. If he was adopted, it's possible that genetic genealogy will be an entire dead end, especially given the shoddy adoption record system that existed at the time. If the foster system was at play, he may get his name back, but not much more, since he may have been entirely estranged from his biological family. There is, of course, a much darker reason why he may not have been reported missing. As with any case involving genetic genealogy, where there are few details known about the crime, there's the possibility that his family was responsible. I remain fairly confident that we'll see a significant breakthrough in this case in the very near future. There's even the possibility, however faint that it might be, that uncovering the John Doe's identity will lead to true justice in his case. But for now, Mr. X is still out there at Rose Hill Cemetery in Cleburne, Texas, buried under that placeholder name, a young man that apparently nobody came looking for. On the night of November 1st, 1916, a retired Marine sergeant boarded a Baltimore Steam Packet Company steamer somewhere along the Chesapeake Bay. By the time the vessel reached its destination on November 2nd, he was gone. The man who'd once held a defensive line against hundreds of enemy fighters in the jungles of Samoa had simply vanished from the deck of a passenger ship. His name was Michael McNally, a Medal of Honor recipient. Until this day, his disappearance remains a historic unsolved mystery. McNally was born on June 29, 1860 in New York City. Not much survives about his early life, which isn't unusual for men of his generation who didn't come from money or prominence. What we do know is that he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in December 1897, shipping out from Mare Island, California. He was 37 years old at the time, which made him substantially older than most recruits. Whatever drove him to military service at that age, it wasn't a young man's impulse. It was a decision made by someone who understood what he was signing up for. Within 2 years of enlisting, McNally would find himself in the middle of a conflict that most Americans have never heard of. The conflict erupted in 1898 over control of the Samoan Islands, with Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States all backing different factions in a succession dispute. By early 1899, the situation had deteriorated into open combat, and American forces were directly involved. On April 1st, 1899, a joint Anglo-American expedition launched an assault on the Velele plantation on the island of Upolu. The force was modest by any standard: 26 Marines, 88 sailors, and about 136 Samoan allies loyal to one faction. They marched inland from the coast to attack the plantation's defensive positions from the landward side, moving beyond the protective range of naval cannons. It was a bad call, and once the landing party moved inland, Allied ships ceased bombardment to avoid hitting friendly forces. At that exact moment, the column walked straight into an ambush. Over 800 heavily armed Samoan rebels, loyal to the German-backed leader, had concealed themselves in the dense jungle. Armed with modern German weaponry, they began unleashing immediately. McNally and two other Americans fortified an area of the jungle and held the position and held off a force that outnumbered them by an absurd margin while their comrades retreated. Once the main body withdrew, McNally and his two companions stayed until the job was done. For McNally, the near immediate outcome was a Medal of Honor, while the larger political outcome was the Tripartite Convention of 1899. This treaty carved up the Samoan Islands between the United States and Germany, with Britain ceding its claims in exchange for territorial concessions elsewhere. McNally retired from the Marine Corps in January 1915 after roughly 17 years of service at the ripe age of 54. Whatever his plans for civilian life looked like, he had less than 2 years left to carry them out, and those final 2 years are almost entirely blank, except for his disappearance. The circumstances of his final night are frustratingly sparse, much like most of his life in general, at least outside of his military years. On the night of November 1st, 1916, McNally was aboard a steamer operated by the Baltimore Steam Packet Company. This was a line that ran regular passenger service through the Chesapeake Bay region. At some point during the night or early morning of November 2nd, he went missing from the vessel. Whether he fell, jumped, or met with foul play, nobody could say, and no explanation presented itself to the crew. In fact, bizarrely, it appears that there was only a cursory investigation, and it's unclear to what extent the authorities were involved at all. The country had bigger things on its mind in 1916, and a retired Medal of Honor recipient disappearing from a passenger steamer barely registered. McNally's body was recovered approximately 3 weeks after his disappearance, sometime in late November 1916. He was buried in Portsmouth, Virginia, in a national cemetery alongside other veterans. Without surviving investigative records from either the steamer company or the police, any discussion of what happened to McNally on that steamer is speculative. The possibilities are the usual ones that attach to people going missing from ships: an accidental fall, a medical emergency that sent him over the railing, or a deliberate act. None of these can be confirmed or ruled out with the available information, simply because his disappearance was never properly investigated. An accidental fall is probably the simplest explanation, since steamers of that era weren't designed with modern safety standards in mind. Railings were lower, lighting was poor, and nighttime conditions on the Chesapeake in early November would have been cold and dark. A single misstep on a slick deck, a moment of disorientation, and the freezing water below would have done the rest in minutes. Notably, many have found it odd that a man who survived close-quarters combat against overwhelming odds in the South Pacific ended up slipping off a boat 17 years later. Those who believe in this theory suggest that perhaps something more nefarious happened, that perhaps he was pushed off, or the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Again, of course, there's simply no evidence to suggest this was the case, because virtually no investigation was ever done. For people who believe the foul play theory, I think it's largely because it just doesn't seem like a correct end for someone who had displayed such acts of bravery throughout his life. In a way, McNally's passing reminds me of an ancient Greek, or perhaps more precisely, Homeric tradition. Ancient Greeks had difficulty accepting that brave warriors who had achieved greatness could simply perish from some absolutely mundane cause. It doesn't seem right or proper that someone like McNally, who had been hailed as a hero, could simply fall off a ship at night and virtually immediately be forgotten. $33 million. That's what Nina Wong paid the first time someone took her husband. She paid it without hesitation and without negotiating, and the people watching, the gangs and criminal networks that stretched across Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China, took notes. Nina Wong had just proven something dangerous. The Wong family would pay, and 7 years later, someone came to collect again. This time, though, Nina's husband Teddy Wong didn't come home, and he hasn't been seen for decades. Born in Shanghai in 1933, Wang Te-hui, as he was then known, grew up in a family that traded in paint and chemicals. His father, Wang Din-shin, moved the family to Hong Kong in the early 1950s as the political situation on the mainland deteriorated. It was there that he adopted the name Teddy and reconnected with Nina Kung Yu Sum, a woman he'd known in his youth, and they married in 1955. 5 years later, Teddy and his father founded China Chem Investment Company. The name was a portmanteau of China and chemicals, but Teddy had wider ambitions than the name suggested. By the mid-1960s, he'd pivoted the company toward real estate, and that decision turned out to be one of the best bets anyone made during Hong Kong's economic boom. China Chem built industrial buildings first, then office towers, then shopping complexes. By 1988, the company completed China Chem Golden Plaza, one of the territory's recognizable landmarks. By 1990, the China Chem empire stretched across Hong Kong, the United Kingdom, the United States, Taiwan, and Canada. Teddy Wong was a billionaire, one of the richest people in the world, and in a territory that small, everybody knew it. On April 12, 1983, Teddy and Nina were riding in their Mercedes when a group of heavily armed men hijacked the car. Nina was blindfolded and shoved aside, while Teddy was forced into a truck and driven to a location where he was chained to a bed for 8 days. The kidnappers, a Taiwanese organized crime group, demanded millions, and Nina paid without hesitation. The kidnapping proved two things at once: that Teddy Wong was worth taking, and that his family would hand over staggering sums to get him back. In a city where billionaire families clustered together in a tiny territory with extraordinary visible wealth, that combination was an open invitation. Other Hong Kong tycoons would face similar threats in the years that followed, but Teddy was the first, and his case set the template. Pay the money, get the man back, move on with life. For most people who had gone through this process, they relocated overseas. Teddy didn't, and 7 years later, it happened again. On April 10, 1990, Teddy left the Hong Kong Jockey Club and walked into an ambush. Multiple assailants moved on him in what was clearly a well-planned, coordinated extraction. The kidnappers contacted Nina and demanded $60 million. She paid nearly half as a first installment, and then she waited. But to her surprise, Teddy didn't come back. There was no second call with instructions for the remaining payment, and most disturbingly of all, there was no proof of life. What Nina didn't know yet was that this operation dwarfed the 1983 kidnapping in scope. Police would eventually discover that the gang operated across 3 jurisdictions: Hong Kong, mainland China, and Taiwan. The ransom money moved from Hong Kong to Taiwan, and Teddy himself was moved onto the Chinese mainland. The gang used separate cells that operated independently, which meant that even if one group got caught, the others could keep running, so long as they weren't the cell with Teddy himself. The mastermind, police would later determine, was a retired Hong Kong police sergeant. He was a man who understood exactly how police investigations worked, what evidence they looked for, and how to stay one step ahead. There were arrests early on, and members of the gang told a consistent story during their interrogations. The only problem is that the story was perhaps too consistent, and investigators believed that it may have been a cover story. They said Teddy was thrown into the South China Sea on April 13, 1990, 3 days after his abduction. Between 1991 and 1993, Hong Kong police arrested 6 more people connected to the operation. They all corroborated the idea that Teddy had been tossed into the sea and nobody would ever find him, but then things got genuinely strange. Nina continued to receive phone calls from Teddy after his disappearance and well after he was supposedly tossed in the sea. These calls continued over the course of a decade, possibly longer, with the last publicly known call occurring around the year 2000. When proceedings began to have Teddy declared dead, she resisted, pointing to those calls as proof her husband was alive somewhere. She even prepared estate documents that assumed his eventual return, that she would just be managing his portfolio in trust until he came back. But the courts weren't convinced, and in 1999, 9 years after the kidnapping, a Hong Kong court declared Teddy Wong legally deceased. The ruling allowed China Chem to function without the legal ambiguity of a missing chairman. It also gave Nina full authority over the business empire, authority that she believed was still rightfully her husband's. Personally, I think there are only 3 real possibilities here, and none of them are satisfying. The first is that Teddy escaped from his captors and went into hiding. In this scenario, perhaps the kidnappers lost control of him. Or maybe he cut a separate deal with one of the semi-independent cells that was holding him. From there, it's possible that he went underground in an effort to protect his family from further attacks by this multinational criminal network. If the calls were real, and Nina knew her husband very well, I suspect this is most likely true, but it doesn't explain why he never returned. The second is that the kidnappers kept him alive for years. They held him, moved him between locations across the mainland, and used the calls as part of an ongoing extortion scheme. When he eventually perished in captivity, they simply disposed of his body and moved on with their lives. The third is that the kidnappers told the truth about April 13th, but lied about everything else. He went into the South China Sea 3 days after they grabbed him. The phone calls were something else: hoaxes, impersonators, or a grieving widow hearing what she needed to hear. Nina Wang took over China Chem and ran it for 17 years. She expanded the company's real estate holdings across Asia and beyond, and by the time she passed away in 2007, she was the richest woman in Asia. She'd taken a company that lost its founder to kidnapping and turned it into one of Hong Kong's largest property developers. But even Nina's death didn't end the story. In 2002, she'd written a will leaving her entire fortune to the China Chem Charitable Foundation. After she died, her feng shui advisor, a man named Peter Chan, produced a second will dated 2006 that left everything to him. The foundation challenged it as a forgery, and in 2010, a civil court agreed and ruled the 2006 will was fraudulent. Then in 2013, a criminal jury convicted Chan of forging it outright, reaching their verdict after 20 hours of deliberation. The feng shui fraudster got 12 years in the slammer, and Nina's billions went to her charitable foundation, as she'd wanted. Somewhere around 1980, In the high pine country outside Flagstaff, Arizona, someone stumbled onto what was left of a man. All that remained was a skeleton, a rusted old revolver, and scattered around his body, a collection of newspapers dating back to the 1950s. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office opened a case file, logged the remains, and waited for a name, but over 4 decades later, they're still waiting. The John Doe ended up earning the name the Flagstaff Cowboy due to his remains being found somewhat near to a location called the Cowboy Country Club. And yeah, it looks like they chose to spell that name with 3 Ks, hence the spelling of cowboy with a K. So yeah, make of that what you will. Might not have been a friendly place, so to speak. The remains weren't found in 1980 because that's when this man perished, and the cops quickly determined he had been there for a long time. The newspapers found alongside his body suggest he'd been deceased for decades by the time anyone located him. But there was more evidence to suggest that the remains had been out there for a long time. 20 years before the rest of the skeleton turned up, someone found a lone human skull, and it went into the evidence locker where it remained. It was later determined that the exact skull belonged to the same individual whose skeleton was found in the early 80s, though it looks like that connection may have been made decades later. Investigators estimated he was a white male, somewhere between 35 and 65 years old at the time of his passing, standing around 5 feet 8 inches tall. The condition of the remains made narrowing that age range almost impossible. Decades of exposure to northern Arizona's dry heat, freezing winters, and rainy seasons had done their work. The rusted revolver found near the site indicated to the police that there was likely no foul play involved. That said, personally I have some doubts, since it remains possible that the perpetrator could have dumped the weapon right there, given how remote the location was. As of 2026, this John Doe's case has been referred for genetic genealogy testing, though the exact status of the investigation is unknown. Given that he passed away in the 1950s, locating any living relatives who have any meaningful memories of this individual might be difficult. However, at the very least, this process may be able to give this John Doe his name back and help determine how he met his end. Of course, even if foul play was involved, given that the crime happened in the 1950s, the perpetrator, if there was one, will almost certainly never face justice. As a quick aside, I find something so incredibly compelling about these Doe cases that got essentially no attention at the time. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The only way these unidentified people will ever get their name back is if they're remembered and talked about. So if you live in the jurisdiction where the Cowboy Doe was recovered, feel free to email the authorities and ask for a quick status update on the case. Something so small could be the final push it takes for this or any other Doe case to finally get resolved.